We're now going to turn to my friend and colleague, Dr. Lawson Brigham, for a report on the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code. Lawson is a distinguished professor of geography and Arctic policy at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. In the U.S. Coast Guard, he served as captain of the polar icebreaker Polar Sea, also on the faculty of the Coast Guard Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School. He has served as the Alaska Director of the Arctic Research Commission and on too many boards and commissions for me to name. Lawson?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dean and Rachel, for having me here. I, too, nursing a cold, Fran, so see if I can. You made it through pretty well. Hopefully I can, too. I also serve as a fellow at Coast Guard Academy's new Center for Arctic Studies and Policy. Both Craig Allen and myself and a prominent Washington lawyer, Jim Ellis, Coast Guard Academy graduate, all trying to give good counsel and help to the Academy. And the Academy's director of this center is in the audience. Drew, wave your hand, stand up. Where are you, Drew? He's somewhere here. I don't think he stepped out, but see Drew Wood, and he'll fill you in on what we're trying to do and help the Coast Guard and help the nation on maritime issues. I'm here to talk about the Polar Code. Polar Code from the International Maritime Organization is in another sphere that Fran was talking about. It's the international sphere, working, of course, on the global maritime enterprise. You can see all the ships today in the Arctic. Many are, of course, world-class and ice-breaking ships, except for maybe the one in the lower right corner, which is a non-ice strengthened cruise ship on the coast of Greenland. If I get the right button here. Which one do I push? Oh, there it is. It is quite remarkable that at the beginning of the 21st century, there are no international rules and standards for shipping in the Arctic. Well, there are actually rules, but not Arctic-specific rules. SOLAS and MARPOL and all the rules for the global oceans apply to the Arctic Ocean, but of course, as we know, we need quite a bit more. There are thousands of ships in the Arctic. At least during the AMSA, we figured there were about 7,000 voyages then, perhaps more today. But we can't lose sight of the other type of marine transportation, so to speak. A Greenlander off the coast of Greenland, and you wonder what this sealer thinks about the large cruise ships in his waters. So the Polar Code is certainly seminal and historic, and it's focused on protecting the peoples of the Arctic and, of course, the marine environment. And interesting enough, and equally important, it provides a level playing field for the global maritime industry. Sometimes that's missed in this argument. Right now, we have a panoply of rules and regulations. The Canadian pollution prevention regulations are different than the Russian side, and we have no regulations here, specifically Arctic-specific in the United States. So I think creating this level playing field, hugely important for the insurance industry, for the investors, for the shippers, the owners, etc. Long history, actually. On the 1st of January 2017, when the Polar Code is to come into force, it'll be a quarter of a century of effort from 1993 to 2017, almost a quarter of a century. You can see important dates. There was an outside working group established in the early 1990s, and the reason for that was that finally we could bring our Russian colleagues into the mix, into the discussion with the change, of course, in the world from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation. And we drafted a Polar Code to IMO, and after a number of years, IMO decided to have voluntary guidelines, but only for Arctic-specific ships. Of course, IMO and many did not realize that most of these ships go both ends of the world, and so the rules would be applicable to the Antarctic as well, but we got there. The Arctic Council and the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment was hugely important to this effort because the Arctic states themselves rallied together to say, no, voluntary is not good enough. Mandatory is what we need for specific rules and standards for ships operating in both polar regions. This IASC is the International Association for Ship Classification Societies. So they help devise and structure a set of unified requirements for polar ships. And then finally, you can see the other dates as we worked up through the Marine Safety Council and approval of the safety rules. The marine pollution rules are in approval status now. And next week at IMO, the human dimension will be discussed, HGW. The standards of training will be discussed in London, and the final rules applying to the pilot house and also to all of the ship's company will be finalized. The third, a triad of issues: safety, environmental protection, and the human dimension. I won't bore you with this except to mention a couple of principles. Right from the beginning, the working group, the outside working group as it was called, which would include icebreaker captains, administrators, classification societies, and a few owners, we decided that there's no sense creating a new convention, that we would add on to already agreed upon MARPOL and SOLAS conventions, but add specific rules for polar ships. But the third point is pretty important, but equally important is the safety of human life, not only on board, but the safety and the protection of people in the coastal communities, and of course the protection of the marine environment. When we developed the initial structure of the code, looked at the Russian Register, the Northern Sea regulations, looked at the Canadian pollution prevention regulations, also brought in the Baltic rules for ships, because in a few decades, if not sooner, the Arctic Ocean will look like the Great Lakes and the Baltic. It'll be seasonally ice-covered sea. And so the rules in the Baltic are very applicable in the future of navigation in the Arctic. The IMO is an outside working group, so we had to negotiate all the time with the IMO principles. And these are some of the early principles. Ships have ice strengthening, that makes sense. No oil carried against the hull, an important component for a polar ship's structure. Everyone has to be trained. The appropriate navigation equipment, we also spoke about redundancy of equipment, not only propulsion systems, but redundancy in the navigation equipment on polar ships, survival equipment, unified classes, and then finally the power of the ships and their endurance in remote areas with no infrastructure. It was pretty easy to apply and argue that the Polar Code should apply 60 south around the Antarctic continent. It matches quite well with the Antarctic Treaty. But of course, in the other end of the world, we had the complication of the North Atlantic Drift and Gulf Stream, the warming of parts of Northwest Europe. Most Norwegians would say that, of course, northern Norway is hardly Arctic. It's more temperate. So we had to take into account Iceland, southern tip of Greenland. But in the United States Arctic, in discussing this with Senator Stevens' staff 20 years ago, we discussed why it would be 60 north in the Bering Sea. Why? It's very clear, world-class fishery, and we would match up the Polar Code boundary with essentially the maximum extent of sea ice in the Bering Sea on any given decade. So you can see this diversion around Greenland. It goes actually south of 60 north to include Cape Farewell, and then this line goes north of Iceland. Only once in the last century has there been ice interacting with the coast of Iceland, so you can be sure that Iceland didn't want to have a requirement to get to Iceland. All the ships had to be polar-class ship, which was hardly made any sense. So you can see how the line goes up. It goes around, of course, Murmansk is an ice-free port, but it also does not include the White Sea, which is in fact ice covered during the winter, but within the really the domestic laws of the Russian Federation. So this zigzag line, now more sophisticated, a little bit more advanced, taking into account the coastline of Russia and Canada and around Greenland. So that's why it's an adjusted boundary to take into account the warming in the North Atlantic. The polar classes themselves, fairly advanced and kind of complex set of rules, but you can see at the top end, ships like the Russian nuclear icebreakers that can operate year-round in all ice-covered waters where they have multi-year ice, first-year ice. And then down at the bottom, at the other end of the scale, are class PC-7, which is just summertime operation by ships that can have low ice class and low structural standards, but can still operate in ice-covered waters with some multi-year ice. All of these definitions are all based upon WMO, because all the Arctic states and most of the states in the world use the WMO definitions. So although they're a bit arcane, and when you read them, they make sense on the international scene. The seminal change really came from the shift from voluntary guidelines for ice-covered waters in the Arctic to a bipolar look, polar waters for ships operating in polar waters. The reason for this was when our first foray into this didn't include the cruise ships, didn't include ships that were operating in polar waters, but might not be ice-covered, like the east and west coast of Greenland. West coast of Greenland in the summer, ice-free, but of course has lots of glacial ice and huge numbers of icebergs, but the Polar Code doesn't actually talk about icebergs. So it's an ice-free environment, but low visibility, very few charts, and lots of other complications. So in order to cover ships like a non-ice strengthened ship like a cruise ship, the guidelines were revised to take into account Antarctica and all these other vessels. The Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment is important to the Arctic Council because it's one of the few large studies, one of many, that was negotiated by the Arctic states. All the recommendations and the findings and some of the language were actually negotiated over a long 8-month period. And as you've heard, this intergovernmental forum operates on consensus, so we needed to get consensus on a number of initiatives, one including some words about the Polar Code. You've seen this report, I hope, and still alive and well. The senior Arctic officials continue to ask PAME, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, for updates. There'll be an update by Canada and hopefully a further update by the United States at the end of its chairmanship, updating the status of all of the 17 recommendations in the AMSA. And interesting enough, in our scenarios work in this large study, we pointed to the fact that really is an ice retreat that's driving the international maritime community to come into the Arctic. It sounds logical, but clearly it's natural resource development that is driving the train, driving the need for marine transportation systems in the Arctic. As witness, all of the ships across the Northern Sea route, except for one, are tankers, bulk carriers, LNG carriers, which in many respects makes the Polar Code even more important today than it was in the past. But it's natural resource development. Of course, sea ice is hugely important, gives longer seasons of navigation, potentially longer seasons of navigation, greater access, all of that. But of course, it's economics driving the global shipping enterprise in the Arctic. Just as we were doing this AMSA, right in the middle of it, we had the MV Explorer sink in the Antarctic. And you would think this seminal event would have some impact on why we need IMO mandatory polar code. The ship was lost, of course, in the Antarctic. It scraped along essentially an iceberg, glacial ice, ripped a 30-meter long crack in the ship, and this ship was actually ice strengthened. You can see a picture in the background in the left, a Norwegian coastal steamer was 100 nautical miles away and picked up all the happy customers who are in the life rafts here and the lifeboats. But this was one prime mover in getting action among the Arctic states to push hard at IMO for mandatory polar code. This is our rubric, just to show you in a second here how the IMO polar code is embedded in the marine safety. But here the 17 recommendations are spread among these three themes. Enhancing Arctic marine safety is all the IMO international stuff, and cruise ship issues. Protecting Arctic people and the environment, pretty clear, I'll show you in a second. And then the third, equally important, is, as you know, in most areas in the Arctic, there is no marine infrastructure. There's none in the United States from the Aleutian chain up. I mean, there's a few minimal response capability and capacity, but really there's no true global marine infrastructure in the United States maritime Arctic, and in most of the rest of the Arctic, except for Iceland, the coast of Norway, northwest Russia. But the rest of the place has no marine infrastructure as we would consider it. Aids to navigation, salvage, SAR response, environmental protection, ports, long list of stuff. And so in the AMSA, the infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure was hugely important. And we included in infrastructure training and expertise in the pilot house and in the engineering spaces for the polar ships. A lot going on, of which the Arctic Council is involved with, PAIM, to track all of the activities, SAR agreement, of course, now, environmental oil spill response and preparedness agreement. Some great advances made, but of all 17, the most important will be the application of a polar code in 2017. So the AMSA did call for mandatory application. We knew that it was important to augment current conventions, MARPOL and SOLAS, but the focus really is on providing a uniform regime around the Arctic and mandatory with also voluntary principles as well. If you look at the list of special areas today on the website for the IMO Polar Code, you'll see all of these and all of the countries and all of the marine areas, I should say, that where there are applicable MARPOL special areas designated. Of course, missing in this list is anything to do with the Arctic. Every other area of the world, from the Caribbean to the Arabian Sea, of course, to the Antarctic, are all covered. So one of the important elements of the Polar Code is to really bring in the Arctic under several of these annexes under MARPOL. Ship categories, all ships are not the same, of course, in the Arctic, and so this is a slide stolen from my friends from ABS, American Bureau of Shipping. And there are three classes, A, B, and C. You can see how they're defined. They correlate somewhat with the polar classes, but it's Class C is the one that we're really dealing with that includes cruise ships, non-ice strengthened ships, ships that are in polar waters that are not necessarily polar class ships. And some images, the Ivik, Russian ice-breaking cargo ship, the Nat Palmer down in the Antarctic, all Class A ships. The Category B ships are ice-strengthened, can be, smaller, but there are a couple examples here, offshore supply vessels. And then finally, Category C, in fact, this Costa ship should not be in these ice-covered waters off the one of the glaciers in the coast of Greenland, because it's certainly not ice-strengthened, has no business being there, but it's a good picture showing you what the challenges are and the risks of operating a ship like this with 4,000 passengers in the coast of Greenland. Let me just summarize a few points. The Polar Code is very complex, lots of naval architects, marine engineers, administrators working on it, but it gets down to these real advances when you collect them all together, the marine safety advances and the marine environmental protection advances, you can see that ship structural standards, safety gear outlined for polar ships, training and expertise aboard these ships, requiring a polar ship certificate issued by the flag state, and a polar waters operations manual developed by the company, by the owner, but mandatory and can be inspected, of course, by the port control state. And then on the environmental side, you can see the annexes. It's not comprehensive. The Apollo Code today is not taking into account black carbon as an example, heavy fuel oil, emissions. Those things will come, but this is certainly a great advance. Essentially, these are special areas for the Arctic in all of these topics. Just a couple summarize some observations. This whole effort over a quarter of a century is a serious effort to have harmonized the rules so that the global shipping enterprise can have a level playing field. Certainly important to environmental protection and protecting coastal communities. And I believe that the important part was bringing in the cruise ships, however size they are, wherever they operate, both ends of the world. Bringing and integrate the cruise ships into this Polar Code is hugely important. Next week at IMO, the HDW folks will be meeting on the human dimension, and the highest priority really in this whole Polar Code is who's driving, what is their expertise, what is their expertise in the pilot house, what is the expertise in training of the entire ship's company. I mean, that's where the issue is. All the technical issues and the protection issues are complex, but we have pretty good solutions for those. It's the training dimension and the comprehensive experience that is necessary to operate safely these ships in the polar regions. Thank you.